Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
Hi there. I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 43, The Frogs, the Poets, and the Fools, a meditation on mindfulness. A riddle for you. Who hears the song the frogs sing at the Twilight Symphony? Not who hears the frogs, but who hears it as a song, as a meditation? Answer: the poets and the fools who stand around and stare at fields. When was the last time you just stood at the edge of a field and really looked at it? Really listened? Listened to the frogs and maybe the sound of the wind. Listened for the sounds of human activity encroaching from a distance, or maybe not from a distance, depending on where your field is. For me, it was last night, when I took a walk to clear my mind and maybe try to think up a podcast topic. I want to get back into a weekly production schedule and am recognizing that in this phase of life, during the school semester when I'm in the academic portion of my coursework, I might have to choose smaller topics than what I had been. That might be topics that are a little less technical, a little less analytical, a little less sprawling and complex, and maybe topics that are a little bit more personal or more practical or more narrow and deep. Now, I don't want to waste anyone's time by talking about things that don't matter or have little substance. That is not my way. I would choose silence over empty words. But I thought, surely there are places that I can turn to for ideas worth sharing if my heart and mind don't feel able to carry some big idea this week. Can I go small? I mean, surely. Can I go as small as the sound of frogs chattering in a hayfield that's fallow for the winter? And I realized the answer might actually be yes. A concept I have been grappling with lately is mindfulness and how we talk about it and teach it in the mental health space in 2025 America, which God knows we all need right now. More specifically, I have been trying to understand my resistance to it as it is often practiced or described in modern helping contexts. The concept of mindfulness as emptying your mind of thought and simply being still and present with what is, via the use of these specific techniques that someone's about to tell you about. Every time I've tried those techniques, it's been very difficult for me, and I realized as I stood there listening to these frogs and kind of thinking about an experience I'd had earlier in the week with, again, that type of mindfulness practice not going well, I realized that part of what makes it hard for me is how I experience my interior awareness and how I have been interpreting the directions. In fact, I am very into mindfulness, but in a way that doesn't sound like the common descriptions. I have a different way of arriving at the same place that all these techniques are supposed to take you. And I want to share how I came to this conclusion in case you listening have had similar challenges. If no one ever tells you where their directions are meant to lead, then you might not know if you too have already found a path to get there. I had picked up the exercise thinking, okay, maybe this is a good one to teach. It's pretty simple. But because I don't teach things I don't use, I wanted to go through it for myself and see how I reacted to it, and maybe get a sense of how it works, or why it works, or what the best on-ramp for it is, and maybe how I can troubleshoot it, that sort of thing. And so it was the exercise. It's a pretty common one, I think, where you take an object and put your entire focus on it for 5 minutes and just keep bringing your focus back to it anytime you notice that it has drifted away. And the intention is basically to blank your mind of thoughts and put your focus back on this object and start noticing things about it that you wouldn't have if you hadn't looked more deeply at it, maybe engage more senses with it. And, seems reasonable. I understand that the purpose of this technique is both about discipline and sensory immersion. The notion of mental discipline is that control of our attention is built up like a muscle, and we have to have a strong enough muscle to be able to put our attention where we want it rather than having our attention go where it wants to go. We're going to circle back to the discipline piece at the end. The putting all of your focus on the object and engaging with it with as many senses as possible is supposed to drop you out of your chattering mind and into your body, into the present moment. It is supposed to be a deliberate engagement of sensory awareness, and then you use the discipline to create and hold space for this awareness in your mind. The underlying premises are that first, mental chatter pushes out awareness of the body senses, and second, that engagement of the senses is inherently relaxing to the nervous system. And presumably, this exercise must work for some people because it is pretty popular and pretty common. I found it excruciating and could not tolerate it. It was actively causing me distress to continue, and not the kind of distress that comes from confronting something hard, but rather from doing something detrimental. So I stopped. And I don't think this is an exercise that I would teach, or at least not without a whole lot of other context around it. So I was reflecting on this as I stood there listening to the frogs, wondering if they would be enough for me to make an episode out of. And just being there on the edge of the field, there was this cool breeze on my cheeks and this flow of sounds around me. And the highway 2 miles away sounded more like ocean waves with a kind of sound, and the frogs were singing, and it was just this swelling chorus that would, kind of peak and then ebb, and then there'd be some other species of frog that would chime in over the top. It was really lovely. And I realized that I was actually entirely present and immersed in that sensory experience. I was naturally focusing on it. I wasn't forcing my attention onto it. It was where my attention wanted to be. That moment was where my attention wanted to be. My body was calm. My mind was not chattering. Like I wasn't thinking back over the week and the possibilities for topics with this, oh my gosh, I have to find something, kind of urgency. It was very just reflective. And as I stood there immersed, little insights would pop into my mind, like, what about this? Remember this? And it was just really calm. I felt no need to push those thoughts away because my mind did not need to be empty for me to sink into that present moment. But I also realized that my mind is really never empty. It's simply empty of what mindfulness refers to as thought. And here's my big insight. This whole situation could have been avoided if I had stopped to figure out what all of those books and all of those website writers meant when they talked about thought and thinking and emptying your mind. Because being conscious of something, having an awareness of something and being aware of that awareness, is that the same as thinking about something? To me, the answer is yes, but I don't think that is what mindfulness means by thinking. And I think for mindfulness, that answer might in fact be no, that's not thinking. So let's have a little side quest into the nature of consciousness, because that's what we do around here. Simon Roper on YouTube has some really great video essays about the phenomena of consciousness and where the first irreducible aspect of knowingness is, and whether different people have a different answer to that question. This notion of qualia, those irreducible cognitions, is not his concept. He was just the first place I heard it, but his essays are also pretty great, so recommend. In describing his own experience of consciousness and his attempt to locate his qualia, he separates awareness from word-based thought or specifically directed reasoning. That conceptualization wandered into my mind along with the frogs and clicked something into place for me about mindfulness. Mindfulness is about dropping out of the directed reasoning state and into the state of awareness that hovers just below it at the horizon of consciousness. It's about being in the qualia rather than the analysis of the qualia being experienced. I do not personally separate this deeper or more fundamental awareness out from the process I consider to be thinking. Even if I spend most of my time at a higher level of abstraction, I do not experience those higher levels of thought at the exclusion of what is below them. The analytic judgment or categorization adds layers of understanding without blocking access to the perceptual substrate. I don't know whether this is the common experience or if most people's analytic consciousness does block access to the unfiltered input of sensory awareness. I also think describing my own experience of thought is helpful for understanding the miscommunication. Much of my own deliberate synthesis of information and comprehension is nonverbal, transrational, associative, image or emotive or symbol-based. I call this thinking. For me, this is a large part of my thinking. In terms of Jungian cognitive functions, my dominant function, the perceptual filter through which I experience everything, is introverted intuition. This process is correlated to symbolic thought and complex metaphors. In other words, my dominant mode of thought are these leaps of intuition that reach my awareness as spontaneously formed analogous structures which allow me to hold complex ideas in a relatively simple form. This is a qualitatively different form of thought than reasoning-based thinking, and it is also different from a pure interoceptive or body-based awareness. Most importantly, it is something I can't not do. I don't know how to form conscious coherence without holistic perceptual symbolism. So, of course, I did not understand that the word thinking was being used to mean something other than what I was doing when other people talked about thinking and thinking too much and overthinking. Introverted intuition is also closely linked to the inner observer, the part of our consciousness that sits above our thoughts and can think about our thinking. My mind operates from a meta perspective as my default and has since I was a kid. That is, I have an inescapable awareness of my own awareness, my own cognitive processing. Again, what I call my thoughts. Part of my thoughts, part of my thinking, is this metacognition, as well as the transrational symbolic imagery, often when I say I am thinking about something, one or both of these types of cognition are involved. So as I'm standing there at the edge of the field, listening to these frogs, I have a couple different threads that are hovering, ready to weave together against the weft of that moment where they're all kind of gathered. First was my recent experience of distress trying that mindfulness technique. Second was the echo of previous frustrations and distresses with similar experiences of mindfulness techniques, including reading entire books on it, like well-regarded books about the practice that still didn't lead me to where they claimed that they were going to. Also, multiple conversations with my friend who is steeped in yoga, in the philosophy of yoga and meditation, and the ways popular Western use kind of distorts them or will cherry pick practices that really belong to a larger context. And finally, Simon's videos on qualia that I had watched, I think, months ago, but just happened to remember. All of these were layering into my perception of the peace of that moment and the oneness that I was feeling between myself and the world and within myself. And I realized what I consider to be thoughts, products of the acts of thinking, are not what mindfulness means by thoughts and thinking. For many people in therapy space and Western mindfulness teaching, the word thinking refers to the logical, verbal, rational processes of the mind, the reasoning processes that use deduction and induction and inference and comparison and conditional logic to reach conclusions or make decisions. These processes of the mind are often working either to suppress emotions, to justify emotional reactions, or to carry out orders from the emotional self that were not critically examined. So these thinking processes are often associated with the defensive ego, the performative self, that self that acts, which is trying to calculate what it needs to do in order to gain external acceptance or achievement, and therefore safety. These thinking processes can also get caught in loops of going over the same ideas without gaining new insight or understanding, which is often called overthinking or ruminating. These are words from therapy space that have made their way basically into our mainstream vocabulary as a culture now. Overthinking, ruminating, anxious thoughts, busy minds, chattering minds. These are often pointed out as the culprit for people's inability to relax. These thoughts are keeping us edgy and unwilling to drop into our body and in denial of reality because they keep reminding us of all the reasons we have to be afraid, all the things that we haven't done, all the ways that we're not good enough, the worst case scenario outcome for things that we're trying to accomplish or things that we see happening around us, maybe people around us or the world at large. I say this for absolutely no reason in this February of 2025 that I'm recording it. No reason. And this kind of unchecked thinking does contribute to stress and insomnia and anxiety and mental load and exhaustion and burnout. I agree that for a lot of people, the root problem they're experiencing is that they cannot get their mind to turn off and stop this type of thinking. And that's where mindfulness gets offered as kind of a panacea. Mindfulness techniques are aimed at quieting those incessant thoughts, creating space between the mind and the sense of self, and allowing individuals to experience simple awareness, presence with their body self and the now moment, freedom from the pressured, insistent demands of their thinking mind. But very few mindfulness resources define their terms. They use words that we all use and therefore assume that we understand, like thoughts and thinking, in a specific and narrow way without stopping to clarify what they mean. When this happens, communication is compromised. The actual intention is lost. The words that are said do not accurately convey the intended message to the audience of those words. This can cause inaccurate perceptions of the process or intent of practicing mindfulness, confusion about what one is experiencing, or even distress. Additionally, few resources are able to explain what mindfulness practices are intended to actually do, or in what situations they are effective tools. Who should do it, and when, and for what intended purpose? Everyone, anytime, because science is not actually a good answer. The purpose of mindfulness, as it is often taught in the West, is to help you reconnect with your body in a small and therefore safe way. If you have been disconnected from your body self for a long time, dropping all the way into it all at once would be quite overwhelming. Ask how I know. Since one of the rules of therapeutic interventions is not to push someone too far and risk re-traumatizing them, the mental health space really seeks these intermediate steps. So the goal of mindfulness techniques in that context is to slowly reintroduce awareness of the body and the emotional body without creating distress by reconnecting too much too quickly. But if you are already connected to your body and emotions, this trickle of mindfulness will feel anemic and artificial. It will ask you to close off layers of awareness that you are used to tuning into, not because that is the purpose of the technique, but because it is starting from the premise that you have little to no awareness to begin with. And let me be clear, for people who are used to living in that rational mind and cutting off awareness of their body and the emotions it harbors, this type of mindfulness can be a great bridge back to themselves. Mindfulness can absolutely be a way to bring your nervous system out of heightened stress states and back into the calm, relaxed rest state. Racing thoughts absolutely hijack the nervous system and keep it in a fight or flight response. And absolutely deep contact with the body can still that thinking mind and allow your whole system to calm down. So I'm not trying to diss mindfulness here. I'm just trying to explain why I was experiencing it in a way that did not live up to the hype. If the mindfulness resources I had looked at made it clear that the point was to fully relax the mind and the body, I actually think I could have figured out how to modify the exercises for my own needs. Instead, it was always a sense of, well, just do these steps on faith, that it'll bring beneficial results and be good for you. And nobody's good at it at first, and it takes time. It's a practice. It's a discipline. And I tried it in good faith, and it didn't work. And I'm realizing now that is because my needs were different. It was this perfect storm of miscommunication due to language choices, lack of goal definition, lack of word definitions, and my own interior complexity that simply has a different experience than I think what is common. Let me go back to my way of thinking, or what maybe we should instead term my experience of conscious cognition. The stated point of mindfulness was always just to empty the mind and stop thinking. Just be present. But for me, even if my rational chattering brain is quiet, my mind itself is not empty. I have so much awareness of sensory perception and my symbolic processing and that meta-awareness of my own awareness that I don't have to be engaging in my rational thinking process to have an active mind. My mind feels full because it is full of awareness. That is my default. And again, all aspects of that awareness are part of what I consider to be my thoughts. So in listening to instructions without kind of critically examining what was meant by thoughts and emptying my mind, I was trying again and again and again to empty my mind of thoughts and to stop thinking according to my definition of those words. It was essentially an attempt to dismantle my conscious awareness, which is why I found the processes ineffective at best and distressing or destabilizing at worst. Mindfulness is supposed to be a practice that leads us deeper into relaxation and better contact with ourself. But for me, it had felt like this torturous struggle against my own attention. And that's because I was trying the wrong techniques and aiming for the wrong goal. Standing at the edge of that field, listening to the frogs, allowed me to be absolutely present. My mind was easily still, except for that awareness of what is. 5 minutes like that is restorative in a way that a mindfulness practice is meant to be restorative, because it was a place where I was not forcing myself to discipline 2/3 of my attention into non-existence, which is where we're going to come back to the notion of discipline and how and whether it fits into this kind of practice. I think you could argue that if mindfulness is meant to be discipline, then my unwillingness to put myself through the distress of boredom and sitting unengaged by this object in front of me is a failure. I have poor discipline, and I'm doing it wrong to let myself off the hook of forcing my focus to stay where my rational egoic self is telling it to stay. But I have no interest in practices that require me to force myself into contortions, whether literal or energetic. I am not interested in a practice that is led by myself that acts, inflicting distress onto myself that is. I don't hurt myself anymore. I don't put myself that is into distress anymore. Discipline should not lead to distress. We live in a society that rules via external force majeure. So many of us split our consciousness into two selves and only acknowledge our rational self that acts. If your intention with a mindfulness practice is to reconnect to your body, to yourself that is, a forcible discipline that causes distress is counterproductive. It will only disconnect you further from yourself because you are internalizing the abusive, coercive behaviors of a fear and punishment-based society when you force yourself into such a practice. If mindfulness is meant to be about connecting more deeply to your body and your senses, if it is meant to be about quieting the chatter of your egoic mind in order to have more contact with your body self, if it is meant to be about setting aside the demands of the self that acts in order to relax yourself that is and to be present with yourself that is, if that's what it's really about, then the more you can surrender and flow in a mindfulness practice, the better you're doing it, the closer you're getting to the actual intent of the practice. The techniques are options for how someone might get there, but if the techniques are out of alignment with the intention, then they're bad techniques for you and you need to find your own. For me, mindfulness is standing and staring at a field and listening to the frogs as if they were a symphony orchestra. That is my mindfulness. That is the technique that works for me. I'll leave it to you to decide whether that makes me a poet or a fool. Either way, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for being here and spending this time with me. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com. If you want to support the podcast and help it grow, you can recommend me to friends or family. You can leave me a rating and review. You can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?